Yo, what is up, guys? It's your girl Becks, and welcome back to the race rundown. So, for you guys this week, I have the long-awaited, not so long-awaited History of F1 podcast for you. So, before we get started with this slightly longer episode this week, if you like what I'm doing over here, leave us a like, leave us a comment, subscribe on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. If not, follow us on all of the platforms. We are available wherever you can get your podcasts. And let's get right into it. So, this week, because there's no race this weekend, we are doing a History of F1 podcast. Now, I am going to go all the way back to the beginning. So, we're starting off with pre-World War II, early Grand Prix. So, the beginning of the 1900s and the 1930s. This was when the early, quote-unquote, Grand Prix races were happening in France. The first one was in 1906. The rules varied by country. Many were on public road circuits, and the emergence of governing bodies were in place trying to standardise engine limits, weight, etc. However, this was interrupted by a little thing that we like to call a world war. The interruption from the world wars caused a little bit of problems. In 1946, a new rules drafted from what would become F1. The first Formula 1 race, then, everybody, runs in the late 1940s. So, in 1946, new rules drafted for what would become F1, and the first Formula 1 races run in the late 1940s after World War II. So, 1946 to 1950, the birth of Formula 1 / the establishment of Formula 1. In 1950, the first official World Championship season begins with the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, among many others. Drivers' Championship was won by Giuseppe Farina, and had the inclusion of the Indianapolis 500 in the early years as part of the World Championship, though it was many, many different rules. They are now obviously two different races. In the 1950s, there was a number of growing pains. Early decades saw large, powerful engines. Pre-war rules were 4.5 litre naturally aspirated or 1.5 litre supercharged, carried forward initially. However, that was then changed. Rise of iconic drivers, Van Gogh, Moss, etc., and the romantic aura around the Grand Prix circuits. This then led to, with the build-up of everything going on, was a shift from front-engined to mid-engined cars by the early 1960s. Most teams had adopted the mid-engine layout. The last front-engined Formula 1 car raced in 1961, with, in this year, the introduction of the Constructors' Championship in 1958, which is incredibly telling to the future of the sport. So, the reason why there was lots of changes in the 1950s was for many reasons, really. One of the main ones being that many drivers lost their lives throughout this year, with safety becoming a growing concern, but however, it was slow moving. This then led to seatbelt mandates, stronger fuel tanks, early roll bars by the end of the 1960s. There was one thing that influenced Formula 1, kind of, in this time period. A Mercedes went into the crowd at Le Mans, killing over 80 people. Though not an F1 race, it shook motorsport to the core and forced the F1 and the FIA to rethink safety barriers, track design and spectator placement, etc. So, although it wasn't a direct issue for the sport, it still shaped the way that the sport was thinking about safety and things like that. So, in the 1960s, after the 1950s era has ended, aerodynamics becomes more pronounced with the use of wings, downforce concepts, and other things. The engine starts shrinking, and there's more of an emphasis on the cars being light, agile, and reliable. Safety improvements such as fuel tanks, roll bars, and better chassis designs then begin in this stage. With the 1960s era coming to an end in 1967, with the biggest change concerning mandates surrounding safety standards such as cockpit protection, crash structure, and things like that. This was a very transitional decade within Formula 1 and was Quite costly to all the teams, as you can imagine, as they had to do more to protect their drivers. In the 1970s, however, this is where things start to get a little bit more interesting, with a wild west, if you will, of aerodynamics, with people trying new things. So we had the introduction and the rapid growth of ground effect aerodynamics in the 1970s. In sort of the mid to late, using underfloor tunnels to create suction. This was also the first use of commercial sponsorship liveries, becoming more common throughout the 1970s. So we have them to thank for the terrible HP logo on the Ferraris this year. The first use of commercial sponsorships. Turbos first appear with Renault introducing the turbo engine in 1977. Safety is still a concern throughout this, with the turbocharged engines absolutely dominating to the early to mid 1980s, delivering massive power but are often fragile at this stage. So then that leads us to the 1980s aspect of it all. However, I just want to touch on some other things that happened in the 60s, 70s and 80s. So, safety rising and aerodynamic concerns. In 1961, Ferrari's Wolfgang crashes at Monza, killing 15 spectators, showing how much of a need there was for stronger fencing and barriers. In 1968, the use of the first aero wing was by Lotus and Ferrari, with the early designs failing as the wings collapsed, causing major incidents. The FIAs then step in to regulate the height and the strength of those wings. In the 1970s, the ground effect and the safety of each driver. So we then had yet another death at Monza, as well as a death at Watkins Glen. We then had Ronnie Peterson fatal crash at Monza yet again, as well as the introduction of the Lotus 79. Dangerously fast drivers are caused to black out from G-force. So it was a little bit of a wild west in terms of the way the sport was looking, the driver safety, everything like that. In the 1980s, however, because turbos were becoming extremely dangerous, regulations and restrictions, such as boost limits, fuel limits, etc., were gradually introduced by the FIA. In 1983, ground effect was banned, with flat bottom rules introduced. More safety measures, crash testing, fuel cell standards, stronger cars, better helmets, fire suspension, all those things were all brought into place. We also had the rise of iconic teams and drivers in the 1980s, a man that you may have heard of before, Mr. Ayrton Senna, as well as Prost and other drivers were quite prominent in that time period. The introduction and proliferation of electronics, so traction control, active suspension, semi-automatic gearboxes, ABS in some cases, etc. This is where Formula One starts to become, I would say, a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more controlled, I would say. A lot of the sponsorships and the regulations around those begin to change. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in the 1980s. So there was lots of turbo going on, lots of speed going on. Again, lots and lots of deaths in the sport. Gilles Villeneuve was killed in 1982 at Zolder, as well as Riccardo Palletti killed at the start of the Canadian Grand Prix, which brought around mandatory crash tests and cockpit survival cell rules. In 1982, there was a number of other drivers, with Pironi with his career-ending crash due to the ultra-powerful turbo cars. In 1982, there was a driver strike at the South African Grand Prix over concerns. Drivers began to have a bit more influence within the sport at this point in time. The mid-1980s, the turbocharged engines were producing over 1,400 horsepower in qualifying, which led to turbo boost restrictions in 1987, with an eventual ban in 1989 with stricter crash test requirements. So it was a bit of a wild west in terms of safety and the overall cars going through the 1980s into the 1990s. So, after the tragic 1994 San Marino Grand Prix deaths of Senna and Rattensberger, again, I'm butchering these names, I can only apologise. The FIA pushed sweeping safety changes, introducing the low ride heights, skid block planks, restrictions on aerodynamics, as well as enhancements to cockpit safety, crash structures, and more medical oversight on track. The introduction of the 107% rule in 1995 to ensure that slow cars don't qualify simply because grid slots are open, as well as gradual banning or restriction of driver aids such as traction control later in the decade, with a ban of many driver aids, traction control, launch control to emphasise the driver's skill. So they're focusing on, again, a lot of safety throughout this time. They're focusing a lot on reducing the amount of help that drivers get in order for them to be able to have complete control over the car. So the San Marino, it was an absolute disaster, with Rattensberger killed in the qualifying crash, Ayrton Senna killed in the race crash, Rubens Barrichello badly injured in practice. This was pivotal towards the safety of the sport, with the immediate changes being made to cars, such as smaller diffusers, chicanes added to slow the cars down, pit lane speed limits, planks under cars to stop the extreme ride height, and in longer term safety, there was also stronger cockpits, higher crash standards, developments, and this was when there was the introduction of the medical car. Thank God, honestly. 1995, the banning of refueling rigs that leaked during races and caused fires. Absolutely insane footage on the internet if you guys ever get a chance to look at that, with just chaos of just fireballs everywhere. Absolutely unbelievable scenes. Unbelievable. In the 1990s, the driver aids arms race was well and truly underway, with all of those being removed because they made the cars too robotic, which is just takes away from the sport, doesn't it? So then we have a little bit more modern times here. We have the return to pure driving and safety regulations with the hybrids. Da da da. Okay, so they've tried the turbochargers, they've tried the technology, i.e. the ABS, the traction control, etc. And now they have stripped it all the way back to be just for the drivers. Thank God. Honestly, if anyone in the 80s and 90s could drive a Formula 1 car now, it's probably a crazy difference with the amount of technology they have in modern F1 cars. Absolutely crazy. Anyway, the 2000s, there is a strong focus on crash testing, side impact structures, roll hoops, cockpit protection, etc. 2009, major aerodynamic rule changes to reinforce downforce and improve overtaking. Thank God. 2010, refueling banned again for safety and cost reasons. It was allowed, however, between 1994 and 2009. Continuing engine development and moving towards more efficiency throughout this, which, when you think about it, considering they're still trying to be net zero, even now, yeah. Okay, so within this, some elements that caused some of these key changes. In 2000, start line crashes in Monza, etc. New rules on race restarts, safety car procedures, etc. 2005, the USGP tyre scandal, Michelin tyres unsafe at Indianapolis, prompted stricter tyre testing and FIA involvement in the tyre wars. 2009, Felipe Massa accident from a spring from another car that hit his helmet at 170 miles an hour. Absolutely insane. Nothing gory really about that. If you get the chance to have a look at it online, it's scary, thank God that he's okay. Push for cockpit head protection, leaning more towards the halo years later, much to drivers' disappointment. However, we'll get into that. Yeah, Henry Surtees was also killed in F2 by a loose wheel, which again in 2009 led to the introduction of cockpit protection and eventually the halo that we all know and love in the 2010s, which leads us to a little bit more of a modern F1. So sort of around the early 2000s and the 2010s was when I personally started my F1 journey. I used to watch it as a young girly with my dad. We used to cheer on Lewis Hamilton and Jenson Button for McLaren, and it was a fun old time. And then Sky bought the rights to Formula One. So, because I did not have Sky TV at the time, because I was not minted, thank you very much, Mr. Rishi Sunak, I couldn't watch Formula One unless it was on the BBC, which, as you guys may know, if you don't have Sky F1, they don't show many races of the season on just general television. It's normally only Monaco and Silverstone, as well as the final race of the season. So I kind of took a dip out of the sport. However, in the late 2010s, early 2020s, that's when I came back. Thank God. Thank God your girl got adult money and was able to buy Now TV. Yay! So, throughout this time, in 2014, there was major shifts in the power units from the V10s and the V8s of the world to the 1.6 litre turbocharged V6 hybrid engines. Boo. No, they're okay. They're not that bad. Okay. The aerodynamic regulations were also tweaked to manage the downforce and reduce the complexity of the overall build of the car, thus improving the racing, supposedly. Some might argue that some of the tracks are still crap, but that's besides the point. Continued safety improvements, the Halo cockpit protection is introduced throughout the 2010s. Lots of people were completely and utterly against this. However, with what happens in the 2010s, you can't, there's no denying that. So, with the Halo introduced, experimentally, might I add, there was also the introduction of DRS, which was drag reduction system, to aid in overtaking, with greater emphasis on show formats, television, and the brand and the fan experience with a global calendar. So the sport has started to become, at this time, with the likes of Lewis Hamilton, Jenson Button, Felipe Massa, Michael Schumacher, there are names out there, and the sport is becoming more and more popular. I would argue personally that the sport did not start to gain traction until probably late 2010s. However, a fan base is a fan base, no matter what. So during this time, some elements that helped to bring forth the change, if you will, was obviously 2014 with Jules Bianchi at Suzuka, hit the recovery vehicle, died in 2015. Super sad. May he rest in peace. Led to the introduction of the virtual safety car with stricter recovery protocols, because that safety vehicle should never have been on the track. And the fact that we even had it nearly with Pierre Gasly in this modern day and age, honestly terrifying. 2017, Halo device testing begins, thank God. In 2018, the Halo was then mandatory. Thank God. Thank God, because in 2020, if we hadn't have had the Halo in 2020, a certain somebody's crash would have been a lot worse. So that leads me on to the next point, which is various rule tweaks year to year to tighten competition, limiting spending, managing technical arms race, etc. in 2020, as we all know, with the spending caps to stop certain teams, Mercedes, from spending too much money. Red Bull. See, I'm not just a Red Bull hater. So in 2022, full new car regulations aimed at promoting closer racing with ground effect aerodynamics, simplified wings, reducing dirty air effects, etc. The fuel change was also changed to a higher bio content, i.e. E10 in 2022, with 2024 and 2025, so last year and this year, tweaking the minimum weight increases, new driver cooling systems, removal of fastest lap points, sad times, rookie running rules, etc. Now, throughout the 2020s, there has been a lot in terms of the biggest elephant in the room, which is obviously 2018, the Halo becomes mandatory. Lots of drivers don't like the Halos. Lots of drivers think that they're a hindrance, if you will, to the actual racing. However, in 2020, we obviously have the Phoenix himself, that is Romain Grosjean, in Bahrain, absolutely sending it, shouldn't laugh really, but I laugh because it was just horrific, absolutely sending it into the barrier, with the barrier splitting in half, the car splitting in half, a massive fireball, and without that halo, that man would have probably been dead, which just reinforced the need for the halo and improved everything at that point. Everybody, I remember exactly where I was when that happened. We all thought he was dead. Everybody, me, my dad, my brother, my mum, like we all thought that we've just witnessed Romain Grosjean die on screen. I think it was evident in Lewis Hamilton's face. It was evident in all the drivers. We all thought the worst, obviously. So the fact that he was able to make it out of that car alive is honestly just a testament to the halo and the effect that that has for driver safety. I mean, I've seen Grosjean's car in person and it's crazy. The fact that he managed to survive that is honestly unreal. If you haven't seen it, I can't believe I'm about to do this, but if you haven't seen it, Netflix captured Romain Grosjean's crash in Drive to Survive, and that is about the only thing I think they've actually done justice to. Yes, they over-dramatized it, obviously, because they want it to be, you know, a key selling point for that episode. But you can see so clearly the shock on everybody in the garage, everybody in the pit lane, all the pit wall staff, all the racers. Like, we all thought he was dead. Every single person thought that man is a goner. So yeah, it was crazy. It was crazy. So in 2022 as well, the regulation reset brought back ground effect. The FIA tightly controlled it to avoid, however, the 1970s style danger. So they didn't want a repeat of history, basically. The current push that they are on at the moment is sustainability, which, don't get me wrong, I'm all for saving the planet. However, I don't see how a sport that burns through tyres as quickly as Formula 1 does can be freaking climate effective. I don't understand it. Climate costs, manufacturer interests, they're fueled by net zero in 2030, and it's just, in my opinion, stupid. I'd like to hear your opinions on that. And then we have, obviously, in the 2020s, the upcoming changes in 2026. With big regulation resets, new power units, they're going to remove the higher electric output. They're going to make the fuel more sustainable. They're going to have new aero and safety structural changes, as well as a brand new team, i.e. Cadillac joining the grid, and we have Audi joining the grid as well, so it should be very interesting. Safety continues to evolve with cockpit side protection, improving crash structures, etc. Rules and governance changes, with some controversy over the last 2 years with FIA and the rules that they keep making, because Lord knows they just keep getting involved when it's not bloody needed. So that is a half an hour rundown of the full history of F1 in the most briefest form. Otherwise, we could be here forever. We could be here forever. This sport has been around for a while. However, I would say it's only really become mainstream in the last probably 20-25 years, which, to me, as a long-time fan of the sport over the last, since I was little, it's very odd to me. But then when you speak to people like my dad who were watching it when he was a kid, you know, the Formula 1 we have now and the Formula 1 that we had then, two very, very different sports. We have come an awful long way. And honestly, I make episodes like this because I just want everybody to know the grassroots of where this sport came from and the impacts of driver deaths and car changes and regulation changes that have led us to where we are now. Because I feel like even if you're not overly interested, it's really good to know just where the sport came from, and I feel like you can enjoy it a little bit more. So with that being said, I hope this helped anyone that wanted to learn a little bit more about the sport. I've been your girl Becks, this has been the Race Rundown, and I'll see you next week. Peace.